Get the workshop started. Welcome. Glad everybody took some time today to show up and come and have a conversation with us a little bit about some of the ordinances, rules, requirements we have to pay attention to when we start to look at permitting activities in this upcoming building season. For those of you who don't know me or remember me, Mr. Smith, I used to work for the county years ago and took a little break for the state, and I came back. I've been on the job about 6 weeks. We have our staff over here. They'll be doing some presentations to you today to talk about some of the really key aspects of the ordinance, things that we want to. Yeah, Tom.
I just want to say Chris Pence is equal to common sense, and we're glad to have you back.
Oh.
Well, all right. I appreciate that. All right. Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. It's good to be back. It's good to see everybody here. A lot of friendly faces, folks that I know. Getting to know the folks here maybe that I haven't met in the past. So, Tom, I do appreciate that a lot. But I think one of the things I want to say just real quick is that I think sometimes it's really easy to get bogged down into we've got the rules, we've got the requirements, but the question is why do we have these requirements? And I've asked this question for 20 years, and I always got the same answer. So I trust everybody in this room is going to keep me going at 100%. Does anybody in here think that keeping clean water is not important? Does anybody find clean water not important? Okay, so we all want to keep our lakes clean, right? And so we all have the same goal. We're heading in the same direction. We might look at it from a different perspective or different angles, but knowing that we have that unified goal of why do people come to Crow Wing County? It's because of our lakes, because of our clean water. Punch a hole in the ground, we can drink water out of the ground. So we're here, that is really what we're here to talk about. What are some of the things that we can do to ensure that goes on into the future? So this is not a one-way street when we're having these conversations today. So we want a lot of questions and interaction, and make sure that you let us know if there's any questions or thoughts or clarifications that you might need. Because we're really here to just try to answer the questions that you might have, and we go ahead and try to play Stump the Dummy. It's kind of fun. We always like the questions we don't have the answers to. We'll figure them out as we go along, and we'll try to get those answers to you in a timely manner. But I would like to introduce, this morning I'm going to bring up Jake Free. I think everybody here remembers Jake. He used to work for the county for many years, was our environmental services supervisor over planning and zoning. He has now transitioned over to the DNR as our local hydrologist, and he just wanted a couple of minutes just to give an idea of what some of the state requirements would be for some permit activities around the lake. So, that's all you.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris. Appreciate it a lot. So yeah, I was kind of where Chris was at for about 5 years, as everybody probably knows. And before that, did some Wetland Conservation Act stuff, and I was a forester before that. But I am the new area hydrologist for Crow Wing County, all of Crow Wing County, and northern Aiken County with the Minnesota DNR. My office is right out of Raynard. So the kind of stuff that I do is public water permit related typically. I also review county and local city township ordinances to make sure they're complying with shoreline rules. So I appreciate Chris allowing me just a couple minutes to introduce myself. If everybody, I'm so new, I don't even have a card or the official DNR awesome uniform on, so I had to wear this. But if you want, it's not even in the PowerPoint, so you can write down my number if you have any questions, if you have a pen. Again, it's Jake Free, F-R-I-E. My number is 218-203-4367. Give me a call with any public water questions. A couple things quick this morning. One, the stuff I deal with is below the ordinary high water mark. That's a set elevation on most of our lakes and in the banks and rivers. So if you're doing anything in public waters or thinking about it, please give me a call. A couple reminders for those of you that get called or are interested in riprap. One, the DNR does need to see some sort of need for that, even if it doesn't need a permit. So erosion, things like that, that needs to be demonstrated. Riprap is allowed without a permit, but it can't extend laterally more than 10 feet into the water. And there's going to be certain restrictions on the size of the rocks, the slope, things like that. I'm not going to go into the weeds on it, but please, if you're interested in riprap, even if you see the neighbor has it and it looks a little different, please give me a call. I'll help you work through that. Second, retaining walls. For those that are interested in retaining walls, those are not typically preferred by the DNR due to construction issues and things like that. Those require permits. Please give me a call if you're interested in those as well. They are going to be a challenge to get approved. Again, this is below the OHW stuff. Vegetation removal in water. Hopefully everybody knows by now that you need aquatic permit from the Minnesota DNR to remove certain kinds of vegetation. Please call the Minnesota DNR. That's actually not me, it's Kevin Martini in this area, but there is regulations on that. So be sure to call before you do that kind of stuff. There's going to be a permit required. Sand blankets, again, low OHW. We do allow them, but they can't be any more than 50 feet wide and no more than 10 feet into the water, and they can't cover emergent vegetation. You're going to hear different stuff from the county today that's going to sound different on sand blankets. That's because that's above OHW, so keep that in mind. I'm only talking about stuff in the water. Always good to determine the OHW before you start your project. Let's say the county gives you a permit for a sand blanket, and you weren't quite sure where that OHW is, and that slides right into the water. All of a sudden, something that might have been approved by the county is now not gonna work for the DNR. So just really keep in mind where that OHW transition point is at so that you're following appropriate regulations. We need permits through what's called MPARs. Just Google Minnesota DNR water permits and you will get where you need to go for the permits for the DNR. Please contact me before you do anything because I can sort things out before you go through this big application process. If you have any other questions about DNR permitting at all, anything I've said, fact sheets, whatever, just Google, do I need a permit, Minnesota DNR? And the first search result will give you a page with a helpful guide on, yes, you need a permit for dredging or this, and that, and we're here to help. So again, I'm not going to take any more of your time, but I appreciate the space, Chris, and I'm sure I'll see you guys around, and it's good to be here. Have a great day.
All right, thanks, Jake. Anybody have any questions for Jake before he ever thoughts? So it's really nice to have Jake in that position. It's nice to have somebody that we know and we work with and really understands Crow Wing County and some of the work he's done. So it's really a big benefit to have him in that position. We're really grateful he's there. What I want to talk to you about first a few minutes is we're in the process of going through some board divisions, and I just want to kind of go over some of the changes that have been proposed and let you know kind of the process, what the next steps are, and then what that might have an impact as far as future permit requirements. So the staff are going to hit some of those more key points that are in the ordinance currently. I just want to remember some of the changes that we're in the process of going through. So we began back in the first part of January, we began the process where we had some ordinance revisions based on some of these different issues that have come up recently, particularly related to like boardwalks. And then we had a 30-day comment period, and then went back to county board and had a discussion with them, and they directed us to go to the planning commission at their March meeting. So March 16th, we're going to be going to the planning commission. It'll be next Thursday for a public hearing for the ordinance revisions. And then based on the recommendation from the planning commission, we plan to go to the county board on March 28th. So just from a time frame, that's kind of what we're talking about. I'm just going to give you an overview. This stuff is all available on our website. You can get a lot more details about that. But one of the key proposals that we're looking at right now is, as Jake had mentioned, riprap. Currently, our ordinance does not regulate riprap activities. The current provision of the ordinance would be to require riprap as a permit. So you would need to get a shoreline alteration permit if you're going to be doing riprap on the shoreline. You would need to, we got some standards in here, and we can get into the details about that in a different point, but basically following the DNR guidelines, we've got the website for how you put riprap in, a lot of what Jake just mentioned. The ticket will be is that when you're dealing with county versus DNR, we would regulate everything under 199 linear feet on the property, and then over that, once you get 200 and above, that kicks in the DNR permit. So that's the difference between the two. So that's one of the big changes. We're looking to do that. There's been some discussions about alternative versus a controlled access lot when you're platting property. And so a controlled access lot is when you have you plat something that's off the lake shore and you get access to the lake where everybody there can get a dock slip out, and that's a prohibited use in Crow Wing County. But we have this alternative access lot where you might have platted some lots on the lake shore, and then your frontage might be pretty wet, bottom wetland fringe. And so the alternative access lot would allow you to plat another separate lot and then run the docks out from there, so you don't have these individual docks out front to some of these more sensitive areas. It's not a requirement, but it is something that's going to be allowed in the ordinance with conditional use permit. So if anybody looks to do those subdivisions and that type of activities, that alternative access is an option to use versus putting those docks and boardwalks out to those sensitive environmental areas in the lake. This one is probably going to have a little bit of impact for those who do some of these patio work that we see down in Shore Tax Road 1 and 2. And so right now, we're going to be looking at changing the ordinance to talk about that both in-ground and above-ground pools and hot tubs in Shore Tax Zone 2 are going to require a permit and cannot exceed that 400 square foot size maximum. So right now, and again, we'll get more details, but you have that 250 square foot and 400 with the stormwater plan. You want to make sure that that 400 square feet includes the pool area, so you can't have a 400 plus a pool separate to that. They're going to be that combined, all that will be combined together. And if there's any questions about this or you have any comments, you're more than welcome to send me an email, and we can bring it to the planning commission meeting next Thursday, or you can attend the public hearing if you want, or you can come to the county board meeting this week. So just because we had a formal comment period, that doesn't mean we're still not taking comments and feedback. I think the big change in the ordinance that we're wanting to do is just clarify the expectations for what it takes to do boardwalks. And because there's been a moratorium on boardwalks for about a year based on some activity that happened that there was some concerns raised at the county board levels. They put a moratorium on that. We're hoping to get this ordinance approved so that we can remove that moratorium, and then boardwalks can be another tool in the toolbox that you guys have to help some of our landowners get access out to the lake through some of those more marginal shoreline areas. And there's really not a huge change in what the standards are as far as that. But one of the key parts of it is that you need a boardwalk needs to be perpendicular to the shoreline. It's not, you don't want it parallel, like, like coming out and then taking a left, or, jog across the shoreline. It needs to be perpendicular to the shoreline. Maximum width is going to be 6 feet. It's going to be built so it's 12 inches above the vegetation, so that there's sunlight can get in there and won't cause that vegetation to die off. You can have railings on it. It can be on permanent posts or pylons, your choice. And it'll take a shoreline alteration permit. One of the things that we're making very clear on it is that our jurisdiction, as Jake mentioned, ends at the ordinary high water mark. So our permit for a boardwalk will end at the OHW. Anything beyond that becomes the jurisdiction of the DNR, our dock, and all their, if there's any required permits for that. So we just want to be very clear that our jurisdiction ends at the ordinary high water mark. Does anybody have any questions about boardwalks? Because I think that's kind of that's one of the things we really want to make sure we get that right going forward. There's a couple of things in here that I don't think is going to matter to you guys a whole lot. We're putting some language in the ordinance about winter windows so that we have these winter agreements for certain activities for like septic systems and for wetland delineations. We have some we actually put in the ordinance a definition for boardwalks, docks, and riprap, so we have that in there. One of the things that could have an impact on you guys, I just want to throw it out there so everybody knows. I know a lot of you guys, when you have your business, you run it out of your house, and so you have your trucks and equipment, and your crew comes and gets the stuff and heads out and does the work. What we're having some issues with is that we've got some situations where people have maybe have a lot that's got a storage shed on it, and nobody lives in the house, and then people, that's where you maybe put all your stuff for work, and you store all your equipment, and people coming and going and getting some pushback from some of the neighbors who aren't appreciating that. And so what we're putting in the ordinance a definition of a non-commercial building. That is a building that's used for non-commercial purposes. This includes buildings that you can use to store equipment and like plumbing, painting, heating, landscaping. So what we're saying is that if you have this, it's going to be okay to use that. Currently, if you're using an offsite building to store your stuff, as long as you've got people coming and going, and it's not a location where you're doing work at the site, but it's just more of a storage issue. So there was some heartburn over that, and the county board wanted us to clarify that in the ordinance. think from that perspective on the ordinances, that those are the main changes. You know, the ordinance is a very dynamic document, and so we do make changes to it. If you have feedback, ideas, like this isn't working, and you need clarification of that, and please let us know. And we're always looking for good ideas to try to make the ordinance a better streamlined product to help you guys know what it is we can invite your clients, figure out, get some work done on the property. So, anybody have any questions about it? It's all again on our website. Feel free to go out and take a look at it. Give me a call if you have any questions. Thomas?
Just one question back on this riprap.
Yep.
You're asking to change the ordinance to require a permit for riprap under 200 feet?
Yep.
And that's a change that's coming.
It's a change. Yeah.
Okay.
So the ordinance would require if any riprap activities up to 199 square feet will require a permit from Corolla County.
190 legal feet, you mean?
Yep. And once you get 200, then you go over and talk to Jake about that.
Great.
Good clarification. Anybody else have any questions about this? So if not, I'm going to flip the ball to Thomas, and he's going to run and give you guys some online permitting. We got some new software, and I want to introduce you guys to that. So.
Hello, I'm Thomas Roloff, Environmental Services Specialist. I've worked with several of you before. There's snacks and coffee in the back if you guys are hungry. Welcome, thanks for showing up today. What we're going to kind of cover in brief is just online services, including the permitting process, and then to back up Chris, a lot of the resources that we have developing are available through the website, and it's a great place to get the most current standards for any of the PDF versions of anything that we've sent to you in the past. If those are live documents, you can refer back to the website. We've been keeping up on getting that updated. And there's tons of resources. So crowwing.gov now, you can still use crowwing.us, it'll work. Online services is where we're really gonna focus here. And then in the land services, land related function will give you a lot of the resources. September of last year, we switched over for land use permits, shoreline alterations, and septic documentation, both for residential and commercial permits, into a new online portal. If you've applied for anything, land use, shoreline alteration, or submitted septic documents after September 27th, this is the format that you've been using. The new features of this is the ability to see on your dashboard application statuses, and the idea in this, initial run of this software is to have a collaborative platform where we can interact with contractors and authorized agents especially. One of the things that we strive to do for you folks is if you are an authorized agent and you want to handle the permit from start to finish, and you don't want your client involved with us, just let us know and we can kind of facilitate that. Our standard practice would be to reach out to you. But as contractors, you'll see homeowners who like to take over what you're doing as well. So this is giving you an idea of, a main hub where you can submit that documentation. Within that, once you've signed up for a free account, you'll be able to access new applications existing, and then for septic professionals or anyone needing to submit septic documentation, it's available there. That includes compliance, designs, site suitabilities, and abandonment forms, if you would like to submit those for us. Back to the website, when you go into that initial first screen where it says land use permits, this is just a snapshot of the additional or anything that you can access to this page. We have it broken down, so if you kind of know what you're applying for, it'll bring you to the right location. We have 2 different softwares facilitating this process right now. So a lot of the stuff that we're working on is going to be in this new software. And then we also have fact sheets available. I wasn't sure in the room if we had realtors, but this resource page, generally titled as Realtor Resources, is also just really beneficial for landowners, contractors, anyone in general. Again, this is going to be that updated live packet sort of information here that we can coordinate and see that working. In these resources, if you're a contractor who sees a list that you would like to be on, that you are not on, please just contact our office and we will get you on that list. The only way we can get you on or take you off is with your permission. So that is built by the public contractors, and we will maintain that for you. On this same page, Not too many things that you folks will run into, but again, just resources available, E911, address verifications and establishments. Wetlands are still going to be done through the old software, the existing software, as well as some of the administrative subdivision and then some of the other permits that are used outside of some of our scope here. Okay, so that was really quick run through. Points that I've been asked to, reiterate is if you're having login issues within your software, we have found that one of the common elements of that issue is a username versus email discrepancy. And so it's a little tricky when we're trying to navigate assistance for you without knowing usernames. That is, something that you sign up for. So we do have an excellent customer service team that helps as much as they can with this, but that's one of the tricky parts with logins is you can't really manage that information for you too well. But other hiccups are just general solution things. And if anyone has questions that they want to elaborate on outside of this meeting, feel free to get in touch with any of us or talk to one of our counter staff upstairs if you have questions about what your screen is looking like. So I'm going to kick it over to Chris. About Article 9, which this information is also available online through all those resources. So crowing.gov. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. I know we've used previous software in the past, the old RT Vision software for permitting, and we're really transitioning to this new CRM software, which is the Microsoft platform, kind of on a county-wide basis. So as we transition to that, there are going to be some hiccups, and so we're, as a staff, we're trying to figure it out and learn it ourselves. So feel free to reach out to staff to assist you with that, and if there's any questions, feel free to let them know. We're trying to figure out whoever's on Teams, if you could mute yourself, that'd be helpful. I think we might be able to mute you for you too, maybe, but. So we need, I asked you if you identify some of these pain points, but it's like, this really is confusing. I'm not sure what the next step is or where it's supposed to go next. Just let either one of our environmental service specialists know that, or you can send it to me, because we're trying to really get into that more specificity of where we're seeing some of those issues. And I can tell you, if you're having one of those issues, you're probably not the only one. So feel free to shoot them our way, and then we'll get back to our programmer and see if there's a way to make that work. So Article 9 is our ordinance that talks about subdivisions and subdivision property. And so I'm not sure, you guys might not be really involved in it, but I felt like it's something that you might want to at least know a little bit about. So things have changed quite a bit over the last couple of years as far as how you do subdivisions in Crow Wing County and what kind of is your process and where do I start? So we put this flow chart together a couple weeks ago just to kind of walk people through like what are the steps. And so, when we take a look at this, the first thing we want to figure out is, where are you located? Because there's a lot of changes that's happened lately based on if you're located in the first assessment, or oftentimes referred to as Northern Township. It's a township north of Brainerd, all over by Merrifield. So if you're in first assessment or you're out of first assessment, that's really where you got to figure out first. Or are you within a city? Because we don't do any planning and zoning with any of our cities in the within the county. So they do their own planning and zoning. They've got their own requirements for lot sizes and how they do their process for getting subdivisions completed. But the next step you figure out is there are some activities that fit into these two categories called exempt. Exempt means that you can split the property if it meets certain size requirements, and it's nothing that requires an approval from us, but it still requires any sort of a lot subdivision, and eventually requires it to be recorded upstairs with our recorder's office and land services. So just because it doesn't require a planning and zoning sign off doesn't mean that it doesn't still require the document to be recorded. So if you would look at some of the things that are exempt that you don't have to come ask permission to split, the biggest one is that if you create lots that are over 10 acres in size and more than 300 feet in width, you can do that without getting a formal approval from our office. You can always get an approval if you want to submit that and have us sign off on it and give you documentation. We're more than happy to do that, but it's not a requirement. We also have boundary line adjustments, and so a lot of times we have some situations where people thought they put something in a spot and they realized that that line between them and their neighbor was not where they thought it was. They thought it was the line of pine trees, but it was off by 12 feet. And so we have a process called a boundary line adjustment where you get a survey done and move the lines around sometimes to get things to line up better on the property. There's also a registered land survey, which is in Minnesota statutes 508. There's a very specific process for that. We don't see that too much. I'm aware we've had 2 of those, I think, in Crow Wing County over the years. We don't see that too often. If you're going to come in and do a public or private cemetery, and you're following Minnesota statute 306 or 307, that is something that is exempt from our platting standards. And then we've also got a situation, if you go to court and you go through a quiet title type action, whatever is ordered at that point by the judge is what happens. So you don't have to come get permission from us to do that. So those are the exempt things that you are able to do as far as subdivisions without having to get approval. So I think the first part we'll look, what do you do first over here in first assessment? So it really boils down to if you're inside the shoreline, if you're outside the shoreline. So if you're inside the shoreline, which is 1,000 feet around our lakes, 300 feet around rivers and streams, and 500 feet around the Mississippi River, if you're inside the shoreline and you're a riparian parcel, you have to plat it. It's an automatic plat. There's no more minor administrative subdivisions allowed in the riparian parts of the county where that requires it. So if you want to create one lot, it's a plat. So that's a big change. That's a really big change. If you are non-riparian, which means you're off the lake and you're back, you're off the lake, you're back 1,000 feet, you're allowed to create 3 parcels or less within 5 years with an admin sub. Any more than that requires a plat. So there's a window of time that you can create 3 parcels. You can create up to 3 parcels within 5 years administratively. Or once you get beyond either 4 or more, or you want to do it in less than 5 years, and that triggers a plat. If you're outside the shoreline area, then you're able to do basically the same thing. 3 parcels less than 5 years and admin sub, and then greater than 3 within 5 is a plat. The big ticket to that is just know that if you're talking riparian parcels, you're going to need to have a plat. There's no administrative subdivisions now for that. Once we get outside of the rules are pretty much the same, except for you still, if you're riparian, it's still a plat. If you're non-riparian, it's 5 or less parts. So over here, it's 3 parts of the 5. Over here, when you're in the outside of first assessment, it's 5 or less parcels. And then greater than 6 requires a plat. So there's a little bit of a different requirement once you're in outside of first assessment. The big reason why that is because first assessment is an unorganized township, and the county board acts as the township board for that. And what the county board decided, they wanted things to be a little bit more restrictive within first assessment than they wanted in the other parts of the county. So if you're outside the shoreline area, you were able to create up to 6 parcels within 3 years of an admin sub, and then anything over that within that 3 years would trigger a plat. And then another point to bring up too, I think is important, is that the county board adopted some new road standards for any plats that are happening within first assessment. In essence, you're gonna need a 66-foot right-of-way. You're gonna have a blacktop road, and that's gonna be required to be taken over by the township, by the county for maintenance. There's no private roads to be built in first assessment. Up in our territory, all roads built for plat will be publicly maintained and will be built to the specifications as dictated by the county highway department. Does anybody have any questions about subdivision of land? I believe, did we pass out the, you guys get a copy of this, by the way? Do we have this as a handout? Okay. Okay, if you would like a copy, let us know, we can get you a copy upstairs, so if you want that. Anybody have any questions about what it takes to subdivide land within the county? Now remember, we still have our townships of Irondale and Crow Wing. They do their own zoning, so if you want to do some work in Irondale Township, we have the land, and should be happy to walk you through that process. And then Crow Wing Township also has their own planning and zoning, so you'd have to contact the township to activities over there. Anybody have any questions about land subdivision? There's a quiz at the end, so be ready. Next on the agenda?
Yes.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dylan.
You got it. Can I have a clicker?
Yeah, of course. It's just
Click, right?
I don't know if it goes back. Of course. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm Dylan Christensen, Senior Environmental Services Specialist. I'm pretty new here, been here for about 6 months. Before that, I was with Black's County, so got a little bit of background in planning and zoning there, but main purpose of kind of my position here is big things are public hearings, so variances, CUPs, things like that, and then enforcements. That's the other big thing. So hopefully I haven't had to work with too many of you here in terms of enforcement, but we'll see. Diving right into it, 2022, our department, Environmental Services, opened up 349 new enforcements. As you can see, there's a steady growth over the years. Obviously, that's not because more people are trying to skirt the rules over time, but with work from home, COVID, all that stuff, Crow Wing County's highly sought after to work here, to live here, things like that. So we have a lot more people coming in, a lot of new construction, things like that, and in turn results in more enforcements. Hence why we hired someone on like me to help take the load off of our permitting staff here. So today we'll talk about enforcement stuff. We're going to start out with WACA, Wetland Conservation Act. It's a state rule that the counties have to enforce, and it mainly deals with wetlands and what you can and can't do in them. There's 8 different types of wetlands, which we'll kind of dive into a little bit more in depth here, just to kind of give you a better understanding of them. Mainly though, with WACA, what's regulated is filling, draining, and excavation. Those are kind of the big 3 items. So anytime you're doing those kind of activities within a wetland, it's regulated. There are exemptions associated with WACA where you can, you're allowed to do some filling, some excavation, things like that, but it breaks it down and they're pretty set in stone on what you can and can't do. We can go into that a little bit more too, but for the types, 3, 4, and 5, those are kind of your typical wetlands. Each of these types have a name associated with them. They're divvied up depending on how much hydrology, so how much water is in the wetland, and how much, what the vegetation looks like and soils, things like that. 3, 4s, and 5s are your typical cattails, swamps. I mean, you got foot of water, all that jazz. 3, 4, and 5, the only difference really between them is just the amount of water that you have within there. 5s are typically like, when you're starting to get into almost lake territory there, we got like 2 feet of water in there, you pretty much know it when you see it. There's a wetland or it might be part of a lake fringe, things like that. The trickier ones are 1, 2, 5, 6, 7. 8's not too tricky. 8 is just your bog, so that spongy, floating, wet bog crap that you always walk on, you sink right through it. I mean, that's pretty typical wetland right there. So we're not going to dive into that one either, really. But 1, 2, 6, and 7, sorry. Those are the ones that we're going to kind of look into a little bit more depth here. Obviously, everyone wants to have a nice sandy beach on the property, and landowners like to push for that. And they'll often say, well, yeah, I got a permit for it, I've got this and that, things like that. Oftentimes, we'll see that the permits they got were for dirt moving or things like that, but not to allow for filling of wetlands and things like that. And especially when we have lakeshore property here, we get into fringe wetlands. So when we start to transition from the lake into an upland area, that transitionary period oftentimes contains wetlands in there. And that can kind of get people into trouble, especially if they get approved for some dirt moving through a permit, things like that, where technically you are allowed to do some dirt moving down there, but you got to stay out of the wetlands because that's a separate permit called the joint application there. Things like this, pretty common, honestly. We run into issues with it. And you just kind of have to use your best judgment and learn and figure out what you can see. I mean, this property here, we had a good chunk of lake fringe here. About 2,000 square feet was filled of wetlands. Look directly to the right of it. We have wool grass, ponded water. You dig down and we get a lot of organic material. So some of that spongy, decaying matter, things like that, stuff like that, that hopefully could get caught and throw off red flags or signals, but sometimes it doesn't. So diving into types a little bit more, type 1, it's called a seasonally flooded wetland. These can be hard to pick up, especially in farm fields, things like that. These are wetlands that are typically only wet from probably early spring, from plow to maybe early June, somewhere in there. Obviously, during heavy rainfall events, it'll start to accumulate there too, but it can be difficult to see. Best thing you can do for crop, obviously we don't have a lot of croplands here, but In croplands, you can see on the edge of the crop, I don't know, soybean, whatever it is, there's crop stress. It's yellowing, it's dying, it's having a difficult time. Farmers usually do plow through these and plant stuff, so maybe later in the season there'll be growth in there, but usually first off, it doesn't grow very well. It's just kind of a mud pit right there, but they'll try and plow through it. Oftentimes you'll get tree canary grass or other taller grasses that pop up in there. So these are good to keep the lookout for. Like I said, they're hard to tell, especially when there's no water there. We have to base it off of topography is a good choice there. You get a natural depression, natural mold there. You've got soils that have little bits of redox in them, or our clays, heavy clays are great for trapping water. Things like that, just keep that in mind. Obviously, not every depression on a landscape or property is a seasonally flooded wetland. They have to meet all these criteria. And the criteria for wetland are vegetation, hydrology, and soils. If you don't have one of those, then it's not a wetland, and you just go about your business. By vegetation, we mean vegetation that likes to grow in wetlands. Reed canary grass, cattails, things like that, woolgrass, these big ones that are always growing there, we look for those. Soils, we'll have redox, there'll be thick organic matter sometimes, muck sitting on top. We'll have, if it's clay, it'll be gray or glade, sometimes even blue if it's really wet year-round. And then for hydrology, it doesn't always have to have water sitting on top of the wetland. It could be bone dry on top, but if you dig down, maybe during the growing period, sometimes we'll hit a water table within a foot, and you'll have the hole starting to fill with water, or in the not growing period, so August, I believe it's sometime in August and later. Sometimes that water table is 2 feet down, but you gotta look for other indicators too, things like that. It can be difficult, but all we can ask is you do your best with it.
If you have a question about a wetland, come talk to us.
Yeah.
So if you think it might be a wetland, come talk to us about it. We want to make sure that we're here to help get that stuff figured out on the front end, so we don't have these issues at the back end, so.
And feel free to ask questions, throw stuff out too, if anything comes up while we're talking. Type 2 is here. This one is a wet meadow, often just looks like a hay field sometimes, or just tall grasses. They're usually wet from early thaw to late June, and then they start to dry out a little bit. Obviously with heavy rainfalls, they fill up, stuff like that. But these ones are typically taller grasses, sedges, reed canary grass, things like that like to dominate these areas, and they'll almost always be monocultures, so meaning only one type of plant's growing there. Sometimes there'll be 2 or 3, but it just depends. When reed canary grass gets in there, it takes over everything. But these ones, typically, they don't really have organic matter, so muck, things like that built up in them. You'll step on it, it's pretty solid. You'll dig down, then you'll start to see that redox, those soils showing those indicators. It's usually pretty easy to find a water table on these ones. They are pretty wet usually, but that's just another one to keep in mind. Sometimes it just looks like a hayfield or a tall grass meadow, which sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. You just gotta look at that vegetation. It can be difficult sometimes to figure that out. 6, this is a pretty common one people miss too, shrub wetlands. This one, as you can see, there's a lot of shrubs in here. Typically it's like dogwood, alders, willows, things like that accumulate there. Taller grasses in between that. Even once in a while you get cattails in there if it's super wet. These ones are kind of like type 2s where they dry out probably mid to late June, maybe early July, somewhere there. And there's typically not standing water in them unless there's a heavy rainfall event. But there's still wetlands, pretty much same soil profile where there's usually not a lot of muck in there, anything like that. It's usually typically just black dirt, and then underneath that, sometimes clay, or depends on the soils. There could be sand too, which is even harder to determine those sandier areas. If there's wetlands in them, it can be difficult. And then 7, this one's a hard one too. With 7s, they're forested wetlands. A lot of times people just associate trees with upland areas. That's not always true. Here in a forested wetland, this example, some indicators there you can look for: black ash, green ash. Those trees love this stuff. We got tall grasses, reed canary grasses, and sedges that'll grow in between them. And they'll be wet early thaw out to, I'd probably say, early June, maybe mid-June, and they kind of dry up in the area. Some good indicators too is these trees have moss trim lines on them. toward the bottom of them, there's a lot of moss. If you look at the tree roots, I can almost guarantee they're going to be surfacing there. That's due to lack of oxygen in the wet soils. So the roots will come to the surface to try to help assist with a better oxygen exchange. And so that's a good indicator for the trees there. Also on the ground, we'll have kind of bald spots in it. Like this example, you can see that kind of in the middle of the trees there. It'll just be a bare patch. No vegetation, a lot of just decaying leaves from the season before. Even at the middle of summer or end of summer, there'll just be a pile of leaves sitting there. Usually it's fairly damp. These soils are pretty typical to what I've been describing so far. Not really mucky, just black dirt and then some redox underneath, usually things like that. Water table can also be hard to find here sometimes, so it's good to keep in mind forested wetlands. Look for the bald spots, sporadic vegetation throughout, tall grasses, ashes, things like that. Those should be kind of some red flags where maybe needed.
What type of trees do you think you'd see in that, Dylan? What type of trees?
Black ash, green ash, things like that. You won't be seeing aspen. Aspen is what we call fact up, meaning it likes drier soils, upland soils. So you'll typically see those outside of these areas where did that and birch too. Birch is also a fact up, nice, drier soils, things like that. So keep an eye out for that. You'll also see silver maples and a few other things I can't think of off the top of my head, but
If you see an ash tree, you're probably in a wetland.
yeah, especially a lot of them. Every once in a while they get thrown in there, especially with wetlands. There's not always a clear definitive line of where the wetland ends. That's a difficult part. That's why we have delineators. There's things called fringe wetlands where you have the main wetland basin there. Obviously the wetland is wet, but as you move out of that wetland and you move to an upland area, then you'll start to see, okay, well, here's an aspen, but there's the majority of it's ash, so it's still a wetland. You'll still have some upland species mixed in there, but it's dominated by the wetland species. And then as you move further out toward the upland, obviously those wetland species thin out and more upland species take over. So it's difficult, and with Crow Wing County, we have a 15-foot setback from wetlands, and that's meant more to try and keep you guys out of trouble and for filling wetlands, because it can be very easy to accidentally fill those fringe wetlands. And that's still a violation that we would still have to handle and things like that. Let's see what the next one is. Yeah, we'll go here. This is a common request that we see a lot. People want to throw down some sand, whether they want to get to a beach, they want to make a beach, they want to get to the water just for access. That's typically why we push boardwalks. Obviously, there's a moratorium right now, which is unfortunate. But boardwalks are the preferred route because they are technically not impacts on wetlands, and you can just go in and you're good to go as long as it's following those criteria that we listed earlier in the ordinance. But things like this, we'll see this a lot. Just throwing sand down, calling it good. Fortunately, it is a violation. With the Wetland Conservation Act, the DNR does get involved, conservation officers. Sometimes they'll just show up, and if they see something, write you a cease and desist right there. If the work's ongoing, it'll be a cease and desist. If it's finished already, and maybe you're already packed up and gone, you could receive an RPN, a resource protection notice from conservation officer, stating that, hey, we've noticed there's been some impacts on this job that you may have done, or landowner, or whatever, and it needs to be addressed, basically. So then that'll come to our attention there. And typically then we do a site visit, and we would determine kind of the boundaries, where the wetlands are, what happened, things like that. Even if sometimes there isn't a wetland issue and the conservation officer was incorrect. But typically the result is a restoration order that you'll get in the end. Restoration orders go to landowners and contractors, both. So both are held liable under state rule to rectify the issue. So if a landowner, or even if he agrees to do the work and he's not holding up his end, the contractor can still be liable for that. For wetlands, like I said, restoration order typically results in just ripping out the old fill. Needs to be brought back to the original grade, and it needs to be seeded. Veg needs to be coming back, stuff like that, and then usually that's kind of the end of things. Other ones where if it's excavation, let's say, and we dug a pond where we shouldn't have, then hopefully you still have the spoil pile on site from the original excavation that we can just kind of plop back in and seed it, and those are usually pretty easy, pretty good to go. I don't know if I said this yet, cutting of vegetation in wetlands, that is not a violation. Now, if you cut it frequently over and over and it eventually alters one of those factors. So let's say hydrology water. And so no water can accumulate there because it's constantly, I don't know, evaporating or something. Then technically that's a violation because we're converting the wetland to an upland. But typically cutting vegetation is allowed. So even if someone calls me, he's cutting a wetland, cutting trees down, all that crap, it's allowed. You're allowed to do it. Be careful if you're ripping out the roots with the trees because sometimes that can create technically excavation. We've got a bunch of bumps in the wetlands there. Now, if you are able to shake off all the dirt and fully fill it back in, then okay, cool, that works. But technically that can be an excavation. So,
But don't forget, when we're talking about that, we're talking about vegetation that's not our riparian wetlands.
yes.
We're talking about the ones that are off the lake. So you're still required, there's still ordinance requirements for vegetation removal on the shoreline of these riparian properties. So that, what he's saying, just because it's a wetland on the lake doesn't mean you can go in and cut all the trees or vegetation down. So just know that is true, but it only applies to those wetlands that are not riparian on the parcel.
And honestly, with Crow and County, most of our wetland encounters are probably going to be on lakes. Fringe wetlands from the lake where vegetation removal is regulated. Obviously, sometimes we'll get some 40 acre that's way away from public waters where sometimes there's wetlands on there where they want to do a project, which is great because those projects typically are allowed more fill, 10,000 square feet up to a fill. So if a project owner needs to fill something for a house, shed, whatever, they usually are allowed through some exemptions. They just need to apply for it. Wetlands though, when we get into the range of public waters, that 1,000 feet, then we run into issues with exemptions. It definitely gets cut back. So instead of 10,000 square feet of fill that you're allowed 400 or more. So if it's directly near the water, then it's like 25 square feet of fill. It's really restricted there. You are still allowed to fill under a replacement plan, but that's a long process. There's still the possibility of denial. And that gets vetted through the county, DNR, Board of Water and Soil Resources, and Soil and Water Conservation District. So I won't go too in depth with that because it's complicated. And if you got questions about it, just let us know. We can talk about it. But so back to this, the end result, ripping all of it out. Landowner has to pay for whatever needs to be done or whatever contractor landowner works out. And then once it's done, SWCD, Soil and Water Conservation District, will come out, verify it, sign off on it. You're good to go at that point. Let's see. Oh yeah, I want to touch on National Wetland Inventory. That's a map that we have on our website. A lot of times people use it, they'll pull it up, it shows you boundaries, or we're supposed to show you boundaries of wetlands and their types to help give you guidance on where there are wetlands and where there aren't. Unfortunate thing is that obviously the DNR and staff go out there and verify those wetland boundaries all the time. And sometimes they were found through LiDAR, flyovers, things like that. And that always isn't most accurate, especially with forested wetlands because there's trees and crap like that. And it's hard for that LiDAR to penetrate through there. So it doesn't always pick up those wetlands. All I'm saying with the National Wetland Inventory is use it with a grain of salt. Boundaries are often not exact and they're often wrong types. Usually there's something there when they pop up, but the sizing and the typing isn't always correct. So just keep that in mind. One thing to help you guys out, I recommend contractor responsibility forms. These are forms that you can fill out with the landowner. It basically states that, hey, I've checked with the landowner. He's gotten all the right permits, and he says he has. And so this is the project we're doing. You'll kind of describe the project there, do a diagram so that you ensure that everything's on the same page. And then if you leave and the landowner goes in and dumps another bucket or two in the wetland and says, well, my contractor did it, well, obviously this kind of helps cover your butt, so to speak. So definitely recommend filling these out, having them do it, especially if you're doing a wetland project to begin with and you already know there's going to be wetland impacts and they say they have a permit for it, get this and then send it over to us so we know. It's just a good way to cover your butt. So then that's all I've got for wetlands. We'll kind of phase away from that now. If we have any questions, obviously feel free to ask. But then we'll focus on the shoreline area here, shoreline impact zones. We'll just kind of touch on some of the big things we typically see that are most common. Patios. Everyone loves to have a patio by the lake. Everyone loves to enjoy the lake, and they are allowed to have a patio, but to an extent, as Chris described earlier, 200 square feet, or maybe that's Jake, I don't remember who, but 200 square feet,
250, right?
Or 250, I'm sorry, up to 400 in the back half of the lake setback. Then when we get into the first half lake setback, so let's say it's a 100-foot setback from the lake, when you get 0 to 50 feet, that's 120 square feet. And then if you get to 50 to 100, that's where that 250 to 400 with stormwater management plan kicks in. So the further away you are, the bigger the patio you can have, basically. Some other caveats are if you're in that front half of that setback, the setback, they still have a setback associated with the lake, but they can be up to 20 feet close to the lake. They still have to meet side yard, all that jazz, but they can be up to 20. So this one right here, for example, this one was technically a violation. 1, it's over 120 square feet. 2, it is, I believe it was like 5 feet from the water. So we had an issue there. So multiple issues with that one. 11.8 goes over that in our ordinance. If you want to, feel free to fall asleep and read it, go for it. And I just included a quick definition in there from our ordinance too for patios, things like that. Here's one that we had for a patch enforcement. Great patio, looked great. But I believe it was oversized, if I remember correctly, and possibly too close to the lake there. So it needs to be cut back. Oftentimes landowners will say, well, yeah, I got a permit for this patio, so just throw it in. Well, they probably did get a permit for it, but the permit was likely to meet the setbacks and with the appropriate sizing. And sometimes that's not always conveyed to you guys. And so I would just make sure you check in on that. Unless it was through a variance, sometimes they do get granted variances, which is not very often. Or if it was a pre-existing patio that was already there before the ordinance was put in place, they're allowed to keep it there and they can rebuild it. They just need a permit for that. They can't obviously make it bigger or add to it or anything, but if it's pre-existing or has a variance, it is allowed. So keep that in mind the best you can. For this patio, we have it, ripped it out, had to go through a whole process on that. Oftentimes landowners will push for variances, but I'm just gonna tell you guys, the Board of Adjustment isn't always a fan of variances for patios. We have a hard time getting those approved through them, so it can be a long shot if you go for a variance to keep the patio where it is first place. Ice ridges, another big one. Hopefully with the new ordinance change with riprap, that'll kind of help to address this. A lot of times we have landowners who throw in riprap on the shoreline and then in turn remove the ice ridge. We still have ice ridges protected under the ordinance. There's a definition. It's basically a lake bed that gets pushed up. You know when you see it here, we got a big mound, probably 3 feet high, with a lot of woody vegetation, things like that. You are allowed to move annual ice ridges, so stuff that pops up every year, every 2 years, something like that. You just need a permit to remove those. That's okay. Usually tiny ridge, usually doesn't have any sort of woody vegetation in there or shrubs, things like that. So just get a permit, you can remove that. But historic ice ridges are ones with the trees growing in them, lots of shrubs that have been there for a long time. They're very tall. Those ones, our ordinance does protect them. They provide really good habitat for wildlife. They do great at water retention, especially if you got a property that's sloping straight to the lake and you have basically a wall of historic ice ridge. This does a great job of retention. And they do stabilize that shoreline with that woody vegetation, all those roots in there. Sometimes you'll get undercutting on there and you can fix that by adding dirt moving and stuff like that, as long as it's not below OHW, all that jazz. But this is just something to keep in mind. You can have riprap with ice ridges. Obviously it doesn't look very nice and that's not always what the landowner wants, but that's just how it is. That's in the ordinance. I don't have any before or afters of this one just because I'm working through stuff, but typically come in, shave it down, and then that riprap gets thrown in. Obviously, sometimes it isn't your fault. Sometimes when you get there, the ice ridge has already been removed by the landowner. But if you see it on site and he's trying to go through his project with you, give you a rundown, and you see this kind of stuff, just make him aware of it. You are allowed, just to further complicate things, you are allowed to remove 15 feet of an ice ridge, a historic one, for like a rec area. So let's say they're allowed to have a beach there. They can remove 15 feet of it with a permit, so that would just get looped in with that beach permit. But anything past 15 feet is not allowed. And they would need a variance for it, which probably honestly wouldn't get approved.
I just want to bring up too, so prior to 2010, for those of us who've been around a little bit, there was a point where you couldn't touch a historic ice ridge. I don't know if anybody here remembers that, where you couldn't even alter one to get access to the lake. So all that we're asking you guys to do is when you're working with your clients, to let them know they've got that 15-foot area that they can remove, the rest is to be left alone. What we're seeing, I think, is some of those ice ridges are being removed, and we're starting to see some of those disappear. And so what we need is, and what we're finding, we're requiring restoration to get them put back to where they were. We did ask you just, work with your clients, let them know that 15 feet, and it may not seem much now, but compared to what it was 15 years ago, you couldn't even touch an ice ridge. So the rules, regulations right now, I think are pretty reasonable to allow that access to put your dock out and that sort of thing. So maybe it's a little perspective might help, kind of frame that topic a little bit.
Is that a one-time 15 feet?
One time. Yeah, so Luann's question, was that a one-time? It is. It's a one-time 15-foot removal.
An annual accumulation.
Yep.
Yep, annual accumulations to be cleared out.
Yeah, backtracking, I guess, a little bit, back to the patios. The enforcement process for that typically looks like, it's pretty straightforward. If the patio is just oversized in the area, we just have to trim it down a little bit. It's not anything too complicated. If it's put too close, question?
At the top or the bottom?
I'm sorry, what?
At the top or the bottom, those slopes?
The bottom, so it's a 3-to-1 side slope. Oh. And then at the bottom, so 15 feet at the bottom, so it's like that.
The patios, typically removal of them. If you have to remove the whole thing, you just rip it out, throw down some seed, stabilize that soil so it doesn't run off in the lake. It's pretty straightforward, nothing too complicated. Ice ridges, a little bit more complicated with that, just because we have to reconstruct the structure here that was natural, and it's hard to get back to those natural conditions. Typically what we'll do is we work with SWCD, get a restoration plan going for that. Restoration plans typically look like, we'll use aerials, LiDAR, sometimes we have surveys that have them, but usually they don't. Pictometry, things like that to get a rough estimate, and old assessor photos, to get an estimate of the size, the width, the height, things like that. Then with the restoration plan, it'll specify the material that gets placed, where to place it, to what width, the grade, for what needs to be replanted in it, because you will have to replant woody vegetation to kind of replicate that historic ice ridge feel. And that can be sometimes a costly expense for the landowner, especially if it's an 80-foot ice ridge, which we've seen removed before. That can be difficult for them to swallow that pill. Walkways and stairways, all that good stuff. Let's talk about that. For the ordinance, you are allowed to have a walkway, which Chris kind of was alluding to earlier, 4 feet in width. It needs to be going basically to the lake. We can't have a bunch of meandering all over the place. With bluffs, you are allowed to do switchbacks sometimes. But for the stairways, you can have a 32 square foot landing associated with them, but that landing needs to be associated with either change of direction or the end of a stairway. You can have a landing down there too. It gets really iffy, and I advise against trying to include a patio with a landing. So trying to kind of squeeze a little bit more square footage out of it, that can be a difficult conversation for us to have, and can be some heartburn there. So I advise against trying to do that. But for stairways, it's pretty straightforward for the most part. You're allowed one per property. Here's an example of one where we had a landowner who has a decent piece of land, large, but they threw in 3 different stairways going down to their lake access. In addition to that, they had some offshoots coming on the sides of the stairways for probably setting up sunbathing chairs, whatever, just to relax on. So there's an issue with it there. To rectify that, they had to rip out 2 of those stairways. Obviously, they needed a permit for the stairway too within the shoreline impact zone. Additionally, we had them rip out the offshoot from there too, because technically that's not going directly to the lake. It's 2 walkways, things like that. So restoration, you gotta rip them out, seed it, ensure there's no runoff into the lakes, all that jazz, stabilize it, things like that.
That's our break.
Yep. I want to talk to Lynn. Yep. You guys stuck with me. So I just want to jump up quick. One of the things, so I've been back with the county for like it's been about 6 weeks. And one of the things that I've heard particularly coming from staff from our county board, is that there seems to be a kind of having a rash of after-the-fact issues on some of these permits. And I was able, our first meeting, I came back with the planning commission board of adjustment. I think we had 6 items, like 4 of them were after-the-fact variances. And so, not sure what the scoop is with that and where we're at that, but that's something that we've got to hit that in the butt with that. And so, one thing I need you guys to know is that we hear a lot where you know, the landlord got the permit. I thought I could do it. If you don't have a piece of paper in your hand or something on your phone that says you got a permit, you don't have a permit. So make sure that you have a permit in hand and not just what the landlord told you to do. Make sure that, you know, we've had some situations where we had one last month where, well, my client wanted 600 square foot patio. I want a lot of things, right? But 400 square foot is the maximum, so they're gonna be ripping that out. And so the Board of Adjustment, my observation as I watch them is that they're not supporting these after-fact variances, particularly for things happening down the shorter pack zone. And so what happens is that when your clients come in and want to apply for that, it costs about $2,500 to get the survey done and $500 for a variance. And then when that gets denied, then they're back at the same spot with the restoration and working with staff to get that fixed. So we really want to avoid that. The county board has made it very clear that they really have high expectations for making sure we have compliant activities happening within our permitting. And to do that, they've actually given us some resources that we've never had before. And so today we have with us from the county attorney's office, Stephanie Shook. And so she is doing, her time is dedicated 100% to working on land services activities. And so in the past, I think there's been more, a little more leeway when trying to work on some of these violations in that. That time frame has been shrunk up quite a bit. And so if you have questions about wanting to make sure that you're in compliance or the permit you want to do, the activity is going to meet the standards of the ordinance. We've got 4 field staff over here that are going to do a great job to answer those questions. But we can only answer those questions if you ask for them of us. And we're happy to meet on site. We want to go take a look at these projects with you ahead of time. But we cannot, these after-the-fact variances and these after-the-fact permits and this, they cannot persist. We need to nip it in the bud. And so I'm not pointing the fingers at anybody, but I'm making everybody aware that the expectations are much higher now than they were, I think, in previous years, as far as making sure that we're getting compliance and we're following the permits when we do the activities. So, if anybody has any questions about that, or you want to talk to, you know, we as staff, we're going to take a 10-minute break here, 10-15-minute break. We're going to kind of mingle and kind of go out and, you know, we want to talk to you guys a little bit. But I just really want you to know that from a priority standpoint for me, I'm not going to have a lot of sympathy when it comes time to some of these after-fact variance, you know, permits and doing work without permits and that. So please have a conversation ahead of time so we can get these issues worked out. And we want to minimize the restoration work. If you do work, this is Jenny. She works for the Solar Conservation District, and she's going to help when we have these issues with Dylan mentioned restoration orders. When you do use, when soil and water gets involved, there's a fee for that too. They charge for their time to do those activities and restoration. That's all part of the process. So what we want to do is just minimize your time. We want you in the field doing the work, get paid. That's what we do. We want to avoid these issues with non-compliance. Now, I will say this: we all get to make mistakes, and so we understand that too. But we don't want repeated mistakes with the same issue. So we make mistakes, we learn our lessons, but we don't want repeat. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? If not, we can take a break. All right, thanks.
think this one right there.
I don't know how to use it, but I can hear pretty good, but.
But yeah, just a dump station, that's no problem.
Oh, yeah, but he's stepping on his property, so it's not a gravel pit, so unless he starts selling it.
Or maybe, sometimes they're just. Or 25%. Am I not your phone? Am I not your phone? Probably okay.
Yeah. I wish
I can't, and that's why we need to work on and that's.
Yeah, I see a lot of it's once a year, all of these ones that are here. Are allowed to get.
Yeah, no, I didn't Yes, that will be available.
Good to see you.
You want to do it right next to it. I've seen a lot of this thing, whole lot of this. Obviously, type ones that will last, they dry out pretty frequently.
They were also working on county land at the time, so they were cutting into roads, and they kind of pushed the spots and crossed the water. Spring that went up to there.
Yeah, you can.
Obviously, some of these guys should just take care of their own things. That's DNR starts at the water pits. And like, yeah. Well, that's
Yeah, he said he's on his way, he'll be here as soon as he can.
That whole stretch is already clear to my answer to that is yes. Unless they delegate that to the county. But you'd have to go talk to them. There it is. Stuff what happened to people in the deepest pockets?
Right.
You know?
I always thought they write it up as all of the we gotta talk about it.
That's a lot of dirt. May have changed.
So that's what I'm doing.
We do have some questions. For me? Okay, yeah.
No, me.
I know, I'm crossing the street ridiculing it.
Oh, like those fun natural ones? But that would work as a boardwalk. Elevated. And then now they're taking it. So originally they were, it sounded like. I don't know. Well, it's all part of this development. 200 feet of each one got, you know, the first inlet down to the max.
There's no pressure here, Jeff.
From that.
Property you have, which is like maybe like 10,000.
You know, in like boardwalks, I'm really getting them like those people that properties. That's not good. That's like, okay, it's even with like years on here, but sounds like boardwalk would be great. We need it. And then they're like, what? Well, this too much.
Yeah.
Now they're not, now they're
Then you
making
would
it where
just
this
be,
all
that was the reason that was it. And, like trees down.
Oh, the boardwalks.
It takes a long time to develop hydrosoil, whatever the hell you have. It's hard to develop it. It's a long time with soil saturation, so you can look at them. No hydrosoil, obviously, really do. And then we look at historical materials. As long as you have sufficient evidence that your roots are man-made, historical areas are probably your biggest, right? Like,
You want to try. So you can get like 100 feet.
She's been out there.
But I'm back and I'm done this year and my track. So I'm back. Now, and Katie's taken off. She's out in 2 years. She's done. She's going to ask me with Bethany.
Yeah, and then I'll put together your map.
So then Mitch took that. Mitch goes.
I might have to take pictures. We're all talking.
That was the same day they
Sure, yeah. That was a crazy cloud. Every time it rains, I'll go stir.
Did they get to actually?
I like it. So what's a shoreline riprap?
Imagine the cost of I'm just funny.
Yeah, who's?
All right, guys, we're gonna get rolling in about 2 minutes. What? Because I didn't hear you.
Probably would have joined my dad more than I have.
Let me just say cross.
It's a structure, yeah. Those make something that's actually
I love that.
Thomas, can you get back to your seat, please, so I can start presenting?
Don't do it. That's is this the button? File delete. File delete.
No, just one click forward.
The left one.
You can also, are you gonna need to go fast?
All right, guys. I'm just county, and we're this a lot of questions. First off, we're going to go through a little summary of the stats that we have here over the last couple of years. 2021, we was and approved 362 short-term rental licenses. That number jumped up just a couple in 2022 to 351. And this year, year to date, I think it was March 4th when I pulled those numbers, we were at 182. So we're seeing a little bit of a drop, but we'll talk about why that is moving forward here. So for short-term rental licenses, we require a rental license that is for each dwelling unit on a property, with a maximum of 2 units per parcel. So if you have 2 dwelling units on properties, those would be 2 separate licenses. And we also have our complaints that are monitored by county staff. There's a 24-hour hotline or online service that is available for your use. Those are active. Employees monitoring the hotline 24/7, but we check up on it almost daily. So we can get back to those people that are having those complaints and address the situation that is out there. And one thing that I want to note, actually 2 things here. So 30 violations substantiated, which is a little bit of a dicey thing to be able to do, to substantiate those violations, can result in the revocation of the license for short-term rental. And we haven't had to do that yet, have we, Steph? There's been no pulling the licenses, but we've got to close on a couple of different properties. And so a couple of good ways to substantiate those complaints on properties are like police reports, photos, videos, screenshots of ads, or unlicensed rentals. One other side note that is something we see false reporting of violations may be subject to repercussions. As of yet, that has not had to happen. So it's a little bit scary. At the bottom of these, you've got your 3 different links, which, side note, we will be making this presentation kind of public, sending it out to everybody who has an email address on file that has attended the meeting here. So these links should be live for you guys, and you can just pop in here and click on those. All right, so short-term rental common issues. First one, the big one this year that we're focusing on is the description not matching summary lines or of the license. So on your short-term rental license up in this area, sorry to those guys on the other side, there's a summary line that kind of addresses what your listing is going to be talking about and how many bedrooms and occupancy that you have. We run into a lot of issues. As the highlighted section there, the listing description doesn't actually match what's in that summary line. So in this situation, you're looking at somebody that says they're hosting 2 bedrooms, but they also have a bunkhouse or an extra bedroom that is there. And that could pose some potential septic issues when those extra bedrooms are rented and listed because of the increased occupancy that's available. Another big issue that we run into, not as much anymore, because thank you to our septic professionals, we have received a great push on kind of including all the information needed to make the short-term rental septic analysis. So thank you guys for that. We still run into a couple here and there, which are not those septic professionals' faults. They're just not enough information. But we size based on drain field sizing and tank sizing to make sure that these short-term rentals are size the septic correct, so they're advertising to protect their water. And so if we don't, If we don't have enough information on those compliance inspections, things like that, then we run into issues signing those properties for that license. So common complaints that we see are going to be occupancy. We get, oh, it's in the mid-swing of the season, we get one of those a week. Those ones are very tough to substantiate. Those are oftentimes difficult because we can take into account the occupancy that is available, spending the night at the property. If they decide to have a bunch of liquor over for, say, a little bit of a bonfire, something like that, up until midnight, there's not a whole lot we can do in that regard. Septic, solid waste, and or trash. We get those complaints a lot. That is one thing that we often address with property owners, just to make sure that they have suitable containers for the trash and recycling to the prison property. Parking, essentially, in this regard, you're going to want to just make sure that if you have any short-term rentals or building issues, just don't block emergency access. Otherwise, that could be a potential issue. Noise and quiet hours are starting at 10 p.m. Monday through Thursday, midnight Friday through Sunday. These ones are a complaint that needs to be substantiated by either video or a police report. There's something else we work with in that regard. And septic system overloading and emergency contact response times. One thing that is important to note is that emergency contact, if the hotline people are to reach out to your emergency contact and they don't get back to them within an hour, that per short-term rental ordinance does warrant a violation.
We time out. We just want to make sure that people online are able to hear, so we're just waiting 1 second.
No, I'm having a hard time. It's
Can
still
you
very
mute yours?
muffled.
Are you muted yours? I think you're getting an echo maybe.
I'm not in on it. Let's just go very slowly and loudly into the microwave. Yeah. So the microphone, not the microwave. Go into the microwave. All right. Perfect.
One other thing that I would like to note that we don't enforce for our short-term rental ordinance is homeowners associations, covenants and restrictions. We get a lot of complaints on those. If they have some covenant or restriction that's in their writing or their contract that you have to sign up for when you are becoming a part of that, we don't regulate that. We just issue the short-term rental license, and that is a civil matter, something that has to be taken care of by that homeowners association.
So if the homeowners association says no rental of these properties, you still issue the permit for a short-term rental?
Yes, that license will still be issued because we, the county, we have no way of enforcing those covenants and restrictions within that homeowners association. So that has to be handled in a civil matter through that homeowners association. All right, licenses. So this is just a little quick example. We've got Lieutenant Pete Mitchell from Maverick and Juice LLC. So Steph was just saying that we don't have a formal contract signed from Crosby and the city of Baby Lakes, but it sounds like that is something that's going to be.
Okay, sorry about microphones. For people online, you should be able to hear us now. If that's, we'll keep an eye on the chat. Folks in the back, sorry about that as well. Let me just scoot through this here. And then Luann, to your point too about the covenants and restrictions, feel free to talk to us about that after the meeting. We'll chat about that as well. Right around here at your occupancy. Did we cover occupancy? We did not. Okay, perfect. All right, so did we get feedback, Nicole? Are we good in the back for people? Well, for those who can hear, thank you.
All right, so another change that was made this spring was that the occupancy was reduced from 4 people per bedroom to 3 people per bedroom plus 1 for common space. So in the example here, on the bottom of the screen, you've got a 4-bedroom listing times 3 people plus 1 means a maximum occupancy of 13. An additional note there is that plus 1 additional is available per unit or license that's on the property. So say you have 2 different dwelling units, a 3-bedroom and a 2-bedroom. You're going to have 5 bedrooms total that have that times 3 multiplied for the occupancy. So you get 15 plus you're going to get an additional occupant for the 2 separate units. So the total occupancy is 17. And that is all I have for quick short-term rental update. We have questions on the short-term rental as well.
How long do the cities that are not part of Crow Wing County, at what point, or they can just not do anything, or what's going to happen with those?
Yeah, it's their choice. So
Okay.
there's no, the short-term rental, program that Crow Wing has is it's something that we're not required to do by statute, so it's an option. So the cities can choose to regulate themselves, or they can choose to participate with the county. It's their choice.
And what if they don't choose either?
Then they don't regulate it.
Got it.
So like the city of Pequot Lakes has chosen to not regulate any sort of STR within the city.
So it's not required like Irondale Township. We don't have to make a decision one way or the other. If they don't want to regulate it and they don't want the county to regulate it, we just don't do anything.
Got it.
Anyone in the room have questions about this jurisdictional conversation we're having? Is everyone on page with that about the county? If anyone has a question about where we do and do not apply planning and zoning, let us know. Short-term rentals, those sorts of things. I feel like most of you are pretty well versed in it. And the new permitting software, when you're entering in, if you get to a stop right after you select the parcel, and it directs you to either Sourcewell or, planning and zoning coordinator for a different location, that is an indication to you that that parcel is not in our planning and zoning authority. So the attempt on that one was to halt applications coming through. It wasn't overbearing, but we did have quite a few people that would submit and pay for Riverton, different areas, and then not hear from us or from any of those representatives. And so that was one of the attempts. So if you do hit that part and you feel like the jurisdictional part is confusing, let us know. And then I've been working with Aiken County for some specific parcels that are along county lines. So those can get a little nuanced too for you folks. So feel free to just reach out if you have questions about jurisdiction and who to reach out to about those.
When it redirects you for does it give you, say the email? I'm thinking of Crow Wing Township. I know they used to be with Sourcewell, now they're not. So who to send things to? Will it prompt us?
Yeah,
Okay.
it should be updated, and if we find any updates needing to be made, anyone can report those to any of us, and we can get that. We have that a live link. That's a free link. So, and then for anyone who's doing planning and zoning as well, if you want contact information, numbers changed, emails, let me know, and I can work with our program for that.
And if you contact me, I have the contact person for Crow Wing Township now.
Okay, good, thank you.
You're crowing, aren't you?
Well, I do the inspections and
Yes,
the
okay,
septic.
okay.
But as far as permitting, they have a new company,
Yes.
I think he's out of Piers.
Okay.
That does their zoning.
So we'll look into that after this meeting,
Randy,
I'll
do
make
you know
sure.
his name? Is it Scott? I can't remember, but I have his contact information.
there? Got a question back there.
Yeah, how did you decide on 3 people per bedroom when the state only allows 2 per bedroom and it was designed for septic?
We decided on that number because that's what the county board felt would be reasonable for what people were to use.
So if we know it's gonna be a bed and breakfast, we better design accordingly then, because they're gonna overload your septic system.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that there's a bed and breakfast and there's a short-term rental, we're not calling those the same thing, so. The difference between the two. So the option, I understand where you're coming from, but the option that you had 2 years ago was that people could use a, short-term rental and there was absolutely no oversight at all on it whatsoever. At least now, we have that three person per bedroom plus, plus 1 for the total for the use of that dwelling. So it's not perfect, but I think it's a lot better than we had probably 2 years ago.
I think if we're trying to we'll go with clear waters and having our septic systems treating our septic through the soils, we're still overloading it. We haven't gotten back to where we should be. And then maybe you go to the state and have the state upgrade how they design their septic systems.
Yeah, and I think, because I understand what you're saying, I get that, but I'd also say that, in a situation like this, what we have is a pretty good program. It may not be perfect. And so, I don't want perfection to be the enemy of it, but, we were at 4, 3 now. And so I think we've improved that area. And, when you're dealing with situations of that, it from a county board perspective, it seemed to make sense to them that 3 person per bedrooms plus 1 for the entire house. They felt that was reasonable use of the property, and that was the decision that was made.
All right, one other note I would like to make on kind of that jurisdiction conversation that we're having. If you want a visual representation on what that looks like, we do have these maps that are available. And they're included or some packets here. The areas that are the slashed lines, those are the ones that are opted out of part of or all of the planning and zoning jurisdiction. Do we have any other questions on the rental?
Hello, everybody. I am Nicolette Sibbert, Environmental Services Specialist. I'm going to use my mom voice, so can everybody hear me?
You got it.
I don't want to use, you got it?
You got to use the microphone because they can't hear otherwise up top very well.
Oh, shoot.
You got the lapel mic right here if you want, on the front table.
What is it?
Lapel mic.
It just clips.
Use that one, it clips on your.
Perfect, we'll do that instead.
Bob can't hear that. Can't hear that. Just put that in your pocket and then just.
All right, how is this? Back row, you got me? Can you hear me? Making sure. Okay. Stormwater management, what is it and why it needs to be managed? Water vapor in the form of snow or rain, when it hits the ground, it's stormwater. After it rains or snow or ice melts, eventually those stormwater molecules, it'll evaporate back into the atmosphere. It'll infiltrate or soak into the ground, or it'll run off to a surface, pond, lake, river, or stream. So why does that be managed? As our cities or towns eventually grow and new homes, roads, or commercial buildings get constructed, impervious surface increases. Impervious prevents the natural soaking of rainwater into the ground. So, stormwater can affect our lakes in many ways, from bacteria runoff, chloride, salt, minerals, sediment, or phosphorus. Our main focus on stormwater management for lake protection and restoration is to limit the amount of phosphorus that goes into our lakes. Phosphorus is an important contributor to surface water impairments in Minnesota. And it is an essential element for plant life. But when there's too much of it in the water gets really murky, it gets green, cloudy like that, and it actually suffocates our fish. So when is a stormwater management plan required? You have the shoreline district, which is the first 1,000 feet from any lake, but the first 500 feet is the shoreline protection zone. In that area, once you're over 15% impervious, a stormwater management plan is required. When you get over 20% impervious on riparian lots, a shoreline assessment is required. So staff will come to the property, they'll assess the shoreline and see how much of a no-mow buffer you need to implement at the lake. 25% impervious is a surface limit for the entire area of the shoreline. Once you get to the shoreline buffer zone, it's 500 to 1,000 feet from the lake. Stormwater BMPs are required, so not necessarily a plan, but we still want to see gutters, swales utilized for collecting runoff and preventing erosion. All commercial user development, regardless if you're in the shoreline district or not, is going to require a stormwater management plan, and that's also regardless of impervious percentage. So if you have a 40-acre parcel and we're doing a new commercial development, we have parking lots, we have a building going up, we're still going to look for a plan on how to manage that water. All stormwater plans must be designed for permanent on-site treatment of a 1-inch rain event from all impervious surface coverage on that parcel. So from the house, the driveways, sidewalks, patios, we want to make sure that everything is treated on site and not going to public ditches, your neighbor's property, because we didn't like them last weekend. So then what is impervious surface? This is the definition of the ordinance, Article 46.2. It's a long one. I like to just say that it's any hard surface that prevents water to go into the soil. Impervious surface. So if you have a deck with dirt underneath, it's pervious. But if that deck has a sidewalk or a patio underneath it, it is no longer pervious. It's impervious, needs to be treated.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
How do you classify class 5?
Just want to penetrate through it.
Class 5 is considered to be an impervious surface by the ordinance.
Impervious.
Impervious.
Okay.
So I think it was 2021, winter of 2021, we put together a new stormwater management packet for everybody to assist in making a management plan. So it'll help you figure out do's and don'ts, use your impervious worksheet, create a site plan, and it'll even give you best management practice tips, things to use, so you're not just limited to gutters or rock-driven products. Rain gardens, berms, swales, infiltration basins, all kinds of different things. It'll also break down on how to use the impervious worksheet and how to make a successful site plan. Speaking of site plans, I wanted to give a couple examples of what a good site plan looks like. So on this first property here, you have a lot of arrows showing us which way the water drains on a property. And then they also are labeling their basins throughout the property, showing where water is being collected and how it's not going directly into the lake or onto the neighboring property. This one over here is a commercial property that we received. We were doing an addition, small little addition. Stormwater still has to be updated for the whole entire property. So they created some berms, swales to collect runoff and to keep it on their person. Here's some more stormwater plans. So they can come in the form of on a piece of paper, or I hired my contractor to do a really fancy drawing and maybe you use crayons. As long as it shows me arrows and basins and I can read it, it's a good stormwater management plan. One thing I really want to drive home with stormwater management is buffers. And so when we get over that 20% impervious, we need to show plans with a no-mow buffer at the lake. And so here is an example of the shoreline rapid assessment that staff would perform to tell you how thick your no-mow buffer has to be down at the lake. So once these are completed, we usually have, skipping ahead of myself, sorry. No maintenance buffer. So when you get over 20% impervious, 70% of the shoreline has to have that no maintenance buffer on it, the entire thickness. So if we say 15 feet thick, it needs to be 15 feet thick, 70% of the shoreline. If you're applying for a guest quarters on a riparian lot and your impervious is 10%, you're applying for a guest quarters, we have to do a no-mow buffer down at the lake. That's in our ordinance. So benefits of a no-mow buffer: reduce the sediment and nutrients in the water runoff, allow water collection, and help stabilize the shoreline, as long as creating habitat for birds and butterflies. So usually when I have a conversation with landowners and I say you need a no-mow buffer because if you're impervious, this is what they see. They see no sand, no patio, they just see a bunch of unmanaged vegetation at the lake and they're horrified. This is also what they're used to. Having absolutely no vegetation at the lake, mowing all the way down and just constant maintaining, but there's a lot of runoff that's going here. And this is usually what ends up happening on those properties. We have a lot of erosion from ice and melt, or we have, this is a good year on North Glen Lake with all of the ice dams. And this is just on that previous property. I think I can go back. Maybe not. Properties like this, what happens? And what we want are aesthetically pleasing, I think landowners as well, no-mow buffers at the lake. And so. So if we can create no-mow buffers like this for landowners, I think we would all be entirely happy, and I think it would help protect the lakes. And yeah, so this is what I would like to see, and they're far and few between. Usually it's just some, usually they're not like this. So I think if we can see more no-mow buffers at the lakes that are aesthetically pleasing like that, nice. Where did my thing go?
Yeah. You just want to click. Very good. You're on. You're good.
Good.
Great. Yeah.
Any questions? Perfect.
My PowerPoint.
Yeah, if you just go into the PowerPoint slides right up there. Sorry, Adam.
Yeah, that's all. I can see it. I don't want to be shooting the walls. You got it. Can you see it? Right there.
What, the slideshow?
I'm not a very bad visual. And they see this on. Okay.
Sweet. Get the microphone out? Great. Here you go, right here. How's that?
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
So I work for the Crowing Soil and Water Conservation District. Not sure if everybody is aware of us, but I'll kind of go through what we do. I'm Adam Leski, district technician here. So the things I'm going to be covering today is talk a little bit about what an SWCD is. I'm not sure everybody knows what a soil and water conservation district is and does. Talk a little about our 2022 projects and kind of working with contractors on those. Talk a little about the project types that we design and look at and also accept from contractors in the area. Look at a little bit about our design criteria, give some project examples of the things we do. And then I'll talk a little bit about our watershed-based implementation funding, which is going to be a huge source for us going forward. And then I'll talk a little about a contractor survey that we're developing. So if you don't know what an SWCD is, our whole mission is to work hand in hand with private landowners and even public entities in the area to do basically conservation projects. You can see our vision, mission, and values of kind of what we do, but we are led by 5 supervisors that are elected during the elections, and then we have 6 staff currently. So to cover kind of 2022, these are the conservation projects that we did. This is kind of our report. So we completed 41 projects, and a lot of those you can see are in shoreline projects, similar to probably what you guys work on, but maybe in a little different capacity. We work with forest landowners. We do stormwater projects, put in pollinator habitat, and also do some work with agricultural producers in the area. So you can kind of see our areas that we're working, but generally it's growing and pass. So looking at the money that we directly impact to contractors, these are just our 2022 totals, but as you can see, out of our total project costs that we have, we're almost giving most of that towards contractors. We don't do hardly any implementation besides a few smaller projects ourselves. So a lot of our work is either through landowners doing it or a contractor actually installing it. So you can see it's a fairly good lump sum of money, and it's only going to increase going forward. So you can see the picture on the right here is the Pine River Fish Passage coming out of Big Pine Lake. So these are kind of the project types we do, and I'll be handing out basically a contractor survey. We noticed that we didn't have a lot of information about what you guys do, and we basically take the contractor list that the county has from these workshops. These are things that we're giving out to landowners, and if they don't know what that means and what you guys actually do, they spend a lot of time calling, and also there's a lot of wasted time for you guys to answer those questions of, no, we don't do that, or yeah, we can do that. So these are the things that we commonly do, ranging from forest management to shoreline restoration to stormwater management. These are all things that we work on. So kind of our design criteria, we are looking at biodegradable materials. So I'm sure some of you guys might be using plastics and things like that. In rock riprap, yes, that is plastics underneath, but if we can, we're using coconut fiber, straw fiber, blankets, and we're also getting into the native trees and plants to the area, and that's kind of what we're looking for in our designs. And then we do, in circumstances, do rock riprap, but we require that it becomes engineered. So we don't have an engineer on our staff anymore, but we know companies that do, so we would work with the landowner to do it, and then you would do the install. So these are kind of some of the project examples we do. This on the left is a rain garden that just got installed in the city of Cross Lake this past year. This is with the mill and overlay project that they worked on. So one of the portions of that was doing a rain garden. So you can see the structure leading into a rain garden here. We do native buffers, as you can see in the two pictures on the right. Again, a native buffer, a willow wattle restoration project, and also a cedar tree revetment project. So those are the things that we're working on. So kind of the big message I would say is the SWCDs are going to have a lot of money going forward to do conservation projects in the area through what's called One Watershed, One Plan. But when it's completed, it's called watershed-based implementation funding. So right now we have 2 active plans. So the Pine River Watershed, that red area on the upper, and the Rum River Watershed, the area in purple. So that's over $1.5 million for conservation projects. And a lot of that's being directly funneled towards contractors to install. We also,
Remember, that's every 2 years. That's not a one-time allotment. So that gets renewed every 2 years for a 5-year window. The next 10 years, you're going to see that come available 5 different times. A lot of money.
correct. Just like this. So that's every 2-year basis. So that's a biannual basis. We receive this from Board of Water and Soil Resources. Probably the one that most of you guys work in, Mississippi Brainerd. That one's going through the planning process right now. We're expected to have a completed plan this fall or early winter. That's also going to be another $1 million. And then we have 2 watersheds that the Crow Wings starting their planning process, which it takes about 2 to 2.5 years, depending on how fast things go, and also the Mississippi Sortel. So within the next probably 3 years or 4 years, we're going to have 5 working landowner or watershed plans, and I would say you're looking at probably over $5.5 to $6 million being funneled to Crow Wing and Cass County here and other counties, but to Crow Wing County, so that's stuff we can utilize. So to kind of end this, so we took a look at our county contractor list that we have, and we don't really know what you guys do. So we're asking that you basically fill this out and return this back to us. We basically kind of put your contact information because we're missing a lot of information, and also things that we're looking for. So if these are things that you do, you can just check those off. And then also on the back, there's a list out any other services that you provide. And basically, all the site visits that we do, we give this out to landowners. And these landowners would directly contact you going forward. So if they don't really know what you do, or if you don't fill it out, we're not going to really put you on our list that we send out. So we're encouraging that you fill it out, kind of give us some feedback of what you guys do, and then we'll add that onto our contract list. I'll take any questions that you guys have.
Want me to hand some of those out for you?
Okay. We'll get moving on to the Q&A here pretty quick. Chris has some final thoughts here to follow up. I just want to plug quickly some of our grants. It may or may not pertain to some of you guys, but we have well sealing grants, still funds available. Feel free to apply for those for landowners. That's basically 90% to 50% of the cost of a well seal that we'll cover for them. So feel free to apply or spread the word to them. Also, we have septic upgrade grants for low-income households. Also might not apply to some of you, and we'll get more in depth of that during the septic portion of this presentation. I just wanted to make that aware to you. Ducking out here pretty quick, but we got those 2 grants. Just spread the word about them. For that, Chris.
All right, thanks, Dylan. Just want to say thanks for showing up today. I know you've got other things you can do, but I appreciate that you came and I want to participate and ask some questions. And that. A couple of things I want to close with. One is that big thanks to Adam and Jenny for showing up for the Stormwater Conservation District. Their office is just right across the hall. So if you want to go over there after this, they'd be happy to talk a little bit about some other things. Projects that you might have. There is a lot of money coming in Owen County to follow this whole conservation for the next 10 years. A lot of $1 million. Looking at acres plans, projects. And we, eventually stormwater runoff and all these sorts of things, trying to get a handle on that. So there's lots of projects that you guys might want to look into and see that you want to do or willing to do as far as. So I just want to throw that out there. Second, you'll see on your screen, green piece of paper, it's a survey. We like to have feedback on the well thing, what didn't go well, what did differently. I've instructed staff to lock the doors in the back and leave everybody to perform. My problem locking doors, but if you want to give some feedback, it'd be great. If you don't give any feedback, then you can appreciate it. We're going to break a little bit early today. We kind of got this thing. For those of you this afternoon, the 1 o'clock Septic workshop. Does anybody have any questions they want to talk about right now? Be happy to answer those. If not, staff will get over here. We can be happy to just talk together individually if you have questions. Get some answers coming up.
Come on.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Appreciate it, guys. You just fill your form out and leave it back in the hole. We do appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Chris, any questions online at all? We hijacked your question. There's a lot of shit on it. I was just not going to